Shaka Zulu, the man who transformed the scattered and disjointed tribes of southern Africa into a unified and powerful empire, remains one of the most formidable military leaders in history. His story begins not in the grand halls of kings or the battlefields of great empires, but in the heart of the African wilderness, where the winds of destiny carried him from the depths of humiliation to the zenith of power. Born in the early 19th century, Shaka's rise was a journey marked by hardship, survival, and an unyielding will to forge an empire from nothing. Shaka's early life was steeped in tragedy. He was born the son of Senzangakona, a Zulu chieftain, and Nandi, a woman of humble status. His very existence was a source of controversy and rejection. His mother was cast out from the royal clan before his birth, and his father, though a powerful leader, did not recognize him as his legitimate son. Growing up in an environment of rejection, Shaka felt the sting of isolation and the brutal realities of tribal politics. The world around him was one where power and prestige were determined by bloodlines, and Shaka's own heritage seemed to place him far from the throne. His early years were spent in relative obscurity, living with his mother and other outcasts, away from the comforts of royal life. Yet, even in these years, the fire of ambition smoldered within him. Shaka was not a child destined to remain powerless. His time in the wilderness, surrounded by adversity, forged in him the characteristics that would later define his leadership: resilience, an unshakable determination, and an awareness of how to exploit weakness. Though he lacked the status of his peers, he possessed something far more dangerous: an unrivaled drive to rewrite his fate. In the absence of formal education or privilege, Shaka's early learning came from the harshness of survival. As a young man, he worked as a shepherd and, in this role, honed his skills in observation and patience. He would witness the changing seasons and the ebb and flow of life in the wild. He understood how power shifted, how alliances were made, and how survival often depended on cunning and timing. This formative period also introduced him to the rhythms of warfare, an art that would later become his domain. Yet, it wasn't just Shaka's natural aptitude for war that would make him legendary. It was his extraordinary vision. The traditional methods of combat in southern Africa at the time were based on open field battles, with warriors using large shields and spears in hand-to-hand combat. While these methods were effective, they were also highly predictable and limited in scope. Shaka, however, saw beyond the confines of tradition. He understood that victory did not merely come from brute strength, but from organization, discipline, and innovation. After years of service under the Mfecane chieftain Dingiswayo, Shaka's fortunes began to change. Dingiswayo recognized the young man's potential and took him under his wing, grooming him for leadership. Shaka's military prowess quickly became evident as he applied his newly gained knowledge to the battlefield. He introduced radical changes to the way battles were fought. One of the most notable innovations was his transformation of the spear, the weapon that would become synonymous with his name. Shaka restructured the Zulu military into a highly disciplined force, known as the Impi. This army, unlike any before it, utilized shorter, stabbing spears designed for close combat, allowing Shaka's soldiers to fight with speed and precision. His soldiers were trained to move in tight formations, their shields locked together in a wall of defense, and their spears thrusting with devastating force. Shaka's military reforms did not stop with weapons. He also instituted a rigorous training regimen for his warriors, instilling in them a sense of unity and discipline that was unmatched by other tribes. Every soldier, from a youngest recruit to the most seasoned veteran, was expected to follow strict codes of conduct. Loyalty to the king was paramount, and failure on the battlefield was met with swift punishment. Shaka's vision for the Zulu army was clear. He sought not just to conquer, but to create a force that could outlast and outfight any rival. His soldiers were transformed into relentless, disciplined warriors, driven by a shared sense of purpose and unflinching loyalty to their king. With his newfound power and army, Shaka began to challenge the existing order of southern Africa. The neighboring tribes, who had once looked down on the Zulu, now found themselves at the mercy of a new and unstoppable force. Shaka's rise to power was swift and brutal. One by one, the rival chieftains fell to his might, and the Zulu kingdom expanded at an astonishing rate. The once fractured and divided Zulu people were unified under one banner, and Shaka, their indomitable king, began to carve out a kingdom that stretched far beyond the borders of his homeland. But Shaka's ascent to power was not without its challenges. His reign was marked by unrelenting warfare, as he fought to consolidate his empire and defend it from external threats. His enemies were many, and he had little time to savor his victories. The Zulu kingdom, though growing in strength, faced constant pressure from rival tribes and European colonial powers who were beginning to encroach on the continent. Shaka's strategic genius would be put to the test in battles that spanned vast territories and pitted him against some of the fiercest warriors of the time. Despite these challenges, Shaka's ambition only grew stronger. He expanded his empire through a series of campaigns that left a trail of destruction in their wake. His forces were relentless, moving swiftly and decisively, leaving little room for resistance. Shaka's military campaigns were characterized by their ruthlessness and efficiency. He would leave no stone unturned in his pursuit of victory, using every resource at his disposal to crush his enemies. Yet, as Shaka's empire expanded, so too did his reputation. He became known far and wide as a leader who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. While some admired his strategic brilliance and unyielding determination, others feared him for his cruelty. Shaka's methods were often brutal and merciless. He would order the slaughter of entire villages, leaving behind a trail of death and devastation. His enemies, who once underestimated him, now trembled at the thought of facing the Zulu king in battle. Shaka's rise to power, though marked by conquest and violence, was also a story of transformation. From an outcast child with little hope to the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in Africa, his journey was one of incredible personal and political evolution. His early hardships had shaped him into a leader who was as ruthless as he was visionary. But even in the face of power and success, Shaka never lost sight of the foundational principle that had driven him from the start: survival. His empire, built on the blood and bones of his enemies, was a reflection of the unrelenting will of its creator. As Shaka's kingdom grew, so did his legacy. His reign would go on to influence generations of leaders and military strategists, not only in Africa, but across the world. He would be remembered as a king who defied the odds, a warrior who turned his weaknesses into strengths, and a man who reshaped the destiny of an entire continent. The rise of Shaka Zulu was not merely the story of a king. It was the birth of a new era in African history, one that would leave an indelible mark on the world. Shaka Zulu's rise to power was not the end of his struggles. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in a kingdom that had been transformed by his ambitions and vision. As his empire grew, so did the complexity of the challenges he faced. Shaka's success as a military strategist and a leader had earned him the admiration of many, but it had also drawn the attention of those who saw his expansion as a threat. His kingdom, now one of the most powerful in southern Africa, was not immune to the tensions of a constantly shifting political landscape. The delicate balance of power in the region was in flux, and Shaka's next move would prove to be as strategic as his previous victories. In the early years of his reign, Shaka's approach to governance had been largely shaped by his military mindset. He had come to power through force and violence, and the kingdom he had built was one of strict discipline and unwavering loyalty. His warriors, highly trained and fiercely devoted, had followed his orders with an obedience that bordered on fanaticism. Yet, as the years passed and his empire expanded, the methods that had served him well in battle began to show cracks in the foundations of his rule. The very traits that made Shaka a powerful conqueror, his relentless drive, his uncompromising will, and his absolute control over the Zulu military, were also the traits that made his rule precarious. Shaka was not a king who relied on the traditional forms of governance, which often involved negotiation and diplomacy. For him, the law was simple. The strong survive, and the weak are crushed. This mentality served him well when dealing with external enemies, but began to create tension within his own ranks. The Zulu kingdom, though united under his rule, was a volatile melting pot of different factions, each with their own ambitions and desires. The diverse tribes that made up the kingdom had been brought together through force, but their loyalties were not always guaranteed. The fear and respect Shaka commanded were enough to keep most of his subjects in line, but cracks in his empire began to appear as internal dissent grew. One of the most significant challenges Shaka faced during this period was the growing discontent within his own court. His ruthlessness, which had once been seen as a strength, began to alienate those who had once supported him. His relationship with his family, particularly with his brothers, became increasingly strained. While Shaka's rise to power had been based on military conquest and the elimination of rivals, it soon became clear that maintaining power required more than just battlefield victories. It required stability at home, something Shaka struggled to achieve. His inability to balance his military ambitions with the need for political alliances left him vulnerable to internal challenges, particularly from those within his inner circle. Despite these growing tensions, Shaka continued to focus on the external threats that loomed over his kingdom. The rise of the Zulu Empire had not gone unnoticed by neighboring tribes. As Shaka's conquests expanded, other tribal leaders began to form alliances in a bid to counter the Zulu threat. The Mfecane, once an ally of Shaka, had become a potential rival, while the forces of Ndwandwe and the Swazi were also becoming more aggressive. Shaka knew that his empire could not afford to be surrounded by enemies, and he made plans to neutralize these threats before they could gain momentum. One of the most significant moments in this period of Shaka's reign was his war with Ndwandwe, a powerful tribe to the north. The Ndwandwe, led by Zwaide, had long been a thorn in Shaka's side. Zwaide, a ruthless leader in his own right, had challenged Shaka's authority in the region and sought to expand his own power at the expense of the Zulu Empire. The conflict between the two leaders was inevitable, and it came to a head when Shaka launched a series of raids against Ndwandwe territory. The battle for dominance between the Zulu and the Ndwandwe would be one of the defining conflicts of Shaka's reign. The war with Ndwandwe was brutal and marked by fierce, close-quarters combat. Shaka, ever the master tactician, used his superior military formations and disciplined soldiers to devastating effect. His forces, trained to move swiftly and decisively, overwhelmed the Ndwandwe with a series of lightning-fast raids and ambushes. However, the war would not be an easy victory for Shaka. The Ndwandwe, though outmatched in terms of military organization, were formidable opponents in their own right. Zwaide's forces were highly skilled and knew how to adapt to the battlefield. The war dragged on for years, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But in the end, Shaka's determination and military genius proved too much for Zwaide to overcome. The defeat of Ndwandwe cemented Shaka's position as the undisputed ruler of the region, and the Zulu Empire grew even stronger. Despite his success in battle, Shaka's rule began to take a toll on him personally. The isolation he felt from his own people, combined with the pressures of maintaining such an expansive empire, began to wear on him. The constant warfare, the endless need to assert his dominance, and the demands of ruling a growing kingdom were beginning to take their toll. Shaka's paranoia also deepened. He became increasingly distrustful of those around him, believing that even his closest allies might betray him. His relationships with those closest to him, including his family, were becoming more strained. He had already executed several of his brothers, and his actions had begun to alienate even his most loyal followers. Shaka's relationship with his mother, Nandi, also began to deteriorate during this time. Nandi had been a powerful influence on Shaka's early life, and her support had been critical to his rise to power. However, as Shaka's empire grew, so did his distance from her. He became increasingly frustrated with his mother's influence, viewing it as a source of weakness. The tension between mother and son came to a head when Nandi's criticism of Shaka's policies led to a bitter confrontation. It was clear that Shaka, once so dependent on his mother's guidance, was now increasingly isolated in his leadership. The political situation within the Zulu kingdom was further complicated by Shaka's refusal to adopt a more traditional form of governance. While other tribes relied on councils of elders and diplomatic negotiations, Shaka ruled with an iron fist, and his decisions were often arbitrary and unpredictable. The absence of a stable political system created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty within his court. While his military prowess continued to win battles, his inability to cultivate the political alliances necessary for long-term stability began to jeopardize his rule. Shaka's once unified kingdom was now a powder keg, ready to explode. The internal divisions that had begun to surface were growing more pronounced, and the tension between Shaka's desire for absolute control and the need for a more balanced system of governance was becoming untenable. As the pressures mounted, it became clear that the empire Shaka had built, though powerful, was far from secure. His enemies were no longer just those from outside his borders. The greatest threat to his rule would soon come from within his own ranks. The cracks in Shaka's reign were widening. It was only a matter of time before they would break wide open. As Shaka Zulu's reign continued, the very empire he had built began to show signs of fracture. His military brilliance and unyielding authority had enabled him to unite the Zulu people and defeat numerous rivals. But the internal dynamics of his kingdom were far more complex than the simple military strategies that had brought him power. Shaka's strength as a leader had been rooted in his absolute control over his warriors and his ruthless, decisive nature. Yet, as time passed, the very elements that had secured his dominance began to create a deepening divide between him and his subjects, threatening the stability of his empire. The first cracks in Shaka's kingdom were subtle. His initial policies, which had focused on military conquest and consolidation, began to morph into a kind of autocratic rule. Shaka's reliance on fear and loyalty as tools of governance was no longer enough to maintain order. His increasingly erratic behavior, coupled with his growing paranoia, began to alienate those who had once supported him. His closest allies, the men who had helped him rise to power, now found themselves in positions of discomfort, caught between their loyalty to the king and their growing concerns about the direction his rule was taking. The most significant shift came in Shaka's treatment of those within his inner circle. His relationship with his family, particularly his half-brothers, became increasingly strained. These men had stood by Shaka during his rise, and many had fought alongside him in the bloody campaigns that established the Zulu Empire. However, as the years passed, Shaka's temper grew more volatile, and his willingness to eliminate perceived threats, even within his own family, began to reach new extremes. It was within the confines of the royal family that Shaka's descent into cruelty became most apparent. His brothers, who once shared in the glory of his victories, began to fall out of favor. Shaka's erratic decisions and growing paranoia led him to execute several of his closest kin, fearing that they might rise up against him. The executions of his brothers and other close relatives were seen not only as acts of political expediency, but also as signs of a deeper psychological unraveling. The very men who had helped him build his empire were now viewed as expendable, and Shaka's unchecked ruthlessness left him isolated. But it wasn't just the royal family that began to rebel against Shaka's increasingly tyrannical rule. The greater Zulu population, once unified under a common purpose, began to feel the weight of his leadership in ways that went beyond military conquests. The kingdom, which had flourished under his early reign, began to suffer from the harsh and arbitrary policies Shaka imposed. His need to maintain total control, coupled with the brutal manner in which he handled dissent, led to a growing sense of resentment among the Zulu people. His reputation for ruthlessness, once seen as a sign of strength, began to erode his popularity. Shaka's empire, for all its military victories, was beginning to show signs of internal strife. The warriors who had once fought for him with unwavering loyalty began to question his judgment. The endless warfare, the fear of punishment for even the slightest disobedience, and the isolation that came with Shaka's single-minded determination to maintain power took their toll on the men who served him. The strict military discipline that had once been the backbone of the Zulu army was now being tested by the disillusionment that spread among the ranks. The loyalty Shaka had demanded was increasingly met with resentment and fatigue. One of the most significant sources of unrest within the Zulu kingdom came from Shaka's treatment of the common people. The warriors who made up the backbone of his army were allowed privileges, but for the ordinary Zulu citizens, life under Shaka's rule was harsh. His policy of expansion had come at a great cost to the people. Wars of conquest had drained resources, and the Zulu economy, once flourishing under Shaka's unification efforts, began to buckle under the strain of constant conflict. While the warriors enjoyed the spoils of war, the civilian population bore the brunt of the consequences. The kingdom's expansion, which had initially brought prosperity to many, now seemed to have no end. With every new conquest, Shaka demanded more from his people. The labor to sustain the growing empire fell disproportionately on the commoners, and the brutality with which Shaka dealt with any form of dissent from these groups led to widespread discontent. People who had once looked to Shaka as a hero began to see him as a tyrant, and the foundation of his empire began to erode from within. Shaka's efforts to maintain control over his empire were also complicated by the external pressures of European colonialism. The arrival of the first European settlers on the southern tip of Africa had started to alter the balance of power in the region. While Shaka had focused his energies on unifying the Zulu people and defending his kingdom from rival tribes, he had largely ignored the growing European presence. The British, in particular, had begun to make inroads into southern Africa, and their presence posed a significant threat to the stability of the region. Shaka, however, did not view the Europeans as an immediate danger and believed that his military prowess could easily neutralize any external threat. But this was a mistake. The Europeans brought with them new technologies, including firearms and advanced military tactics, which would prove to be a challenge for Shaka's traditional methods of warfare. The failure to address the European threat was one of the key miscalculations of Shaka's later years. His refusal to engage with the Europeans on any diplomatic level or to understand the potential danger they posed ultimately left his empire vulnerable. The Zulu kingdom, though formidable in terms of military power, was not prepared for the kind of warfare that the Europeans would soon bring to the region. Shaka's disregard for the colonial powers that were slowly encroaching on his territory would later prove to be a critical flaw in his strategy. While Shaka's kingdom faced both internal and external pressures, the personal toll of ruling an empire was becoming increasingly evident. The psychological strain of maintaining an empire built on violence and fear, coupled with the growing isolation he felt from his people, began to weigh heavily on Shaka. His once immense energy was starting to flag, and his mental state deteriorated. The man who had once been a visionary leader, unyielding in his pursuit of power, was now a shadow of his former self. His paranoia continued to escalate, and his temper grew more erratic with each passing day. Shaka's empire, once a symbol of strength and unity, was now teetering on the brink of collapse. His once loyal supporters were beginning to turn against him, and his military successes were overshadowed by the growing discontent within his ranks. The endless war, the tyrannical rule, and the isolation that Shaka had created for himself had turned him into a leader consumed by fear and mistrust. The very people who had built his empire were now the ones who sought to bring it down. Shaka's downfall was not the result of a single battle or a foreign invasion, but rather the internal decay of the empire he had worked so tirelessly to create. In his final years, Shaka became a tragic figure, once revered as a mighty king, but now viewed as a tyrant whose paranoia and cruelty had destroyed the very kingdom he had forged. His legacy, once assured, was now marred by the bloodshed and betrayal that had followed him throughout his reign. The man who had once united a people through the force of his will was now surrounded by enemies, both internal and external, who sought his downfall. Shaka's empire was crumbling, and with it, the vision of greatness he had once embodied. The collapse of Shaka Zulu's once unified empire was not a sudden event. It was the result of years of internal strife, external threats, and the unrelenting pressures of an overstretched rule. As the Zulu king's reign entered its final phase, the cracks that had long been forming beneath the surface deepened, and the mighty empire he had built began to unravel. Shaka's leadership, which had once been marked by unmatched military innovation and a fierce determination, was now plagued by paranoia, cruelty, and an increasing inability to hold together the very empire that had made him a legend. In the later years of his rule, the tensions that had been simmering within his court came to a head. Shaka's descent into tyranny had alienated many of his once loyal supporters. His brothers, who had been instrumental in his rise to power, were either dead or exiled, victims of his increasingly erratic decisions. Among the few left in his inner circle, discontent was growing. His violent purges of perceived enemies, including family members, had instilled a deep fear among those closest to him. Shaka had become a man ruled by suspicion, unable to trust even those who had stood by him through thick and thin. The psychological toll of ruling with such absolute power began to manifest in increasingly erratic behavior. The once immensely charismatic and calculating ruler was now a king who was losing his grip on reality. His paranoia intensified, and he began to believe that his enemies were plotting against him from all corners of the kingdom. His decisions, once sharp and pragmatic, now seemed driven by irrational fear and a sense of impending doom. This descent into madness alienated the very warriors who had been the backbone of his empire. As Shaka's behavior grew more unpredictable, so did the tensions within his military ranks. The Zulu army, which had once been a well-oiled machine under his command, began to suffer under the weight of his increasingly erratic orders. Shaka's warriors, long trained in his methods and fiercely loyal to him, now found themselves questioning their king's judgment. The brutal discipline that had made the Zulu army the most feared in Africa had begun to erode as men began to hesitate in following orders. The very force that had conquered neighboring kingdoms and expanded the Zulu Empire was now showing signs of fragmentation. Despite these growing issues, Shaka continued to focus on expanding his empire, seeking new territories to conquer and new enemies to defeat. The unrelenting drive that had once fueled his military campaigns now seemed more like a desperate attempt to maintain control over his increasingly unstable kingdom. Yet, even as he launched new military campaigns, the cracks in his reign were impossible to ignore. His expansionist ambitions, which had once been met with awe and respect, now seemed reckless, as the resources needed to sustain such an empire were stretched thin. The kingdom was drained from years of war, and the ordinary people, who had once supported Shaka's vision of greatness, were now suffering under the weight of constant warfare and exploitation. One of the most significant challenges Shaka faced in these years was the mounting dissatisfaction within his own people. The Zulu warriors, who had once viewed their king as a figure of inspiration and power, were now weary of his unrelenting demands. The constant state of war, coupled with Shaka's increasingly harsh treatment of those around him, took a toll on morale. The warriors, who had been raised to revere their king, now began to question whether the price of loyalty was too high. The relentless conquests, the loss of countless men in battle, and the growing brutality of Shaka's rule all began to wear on the spirit of the army. Discontent began to spread through the ranks, and whispers of rebellion started to surface. Shaka's failure to recognize the signs of disillusionment within his military ranks proved to be a fatal mistake. While he continued to expand his empire, he failed to understand the toll that his brutal methods and constant demands were taking on his warriors. His reliance on fear and loyalty had worked in the past, but now those very tools of control were beginning to backfire. The cracks in his army were widening, and the Zulu warriors, once his greatest strength, were now starting to question their king's leadership. Meanwhile, the internal turmoil within the royal family was reaching its peak. Shaka's relationships with his remaining relatives had become strained to the breaking point. His brothers, cousins, and other close family members had been subjected to his wrath, either executed or exiled for the slightest perceived betrayal. Now, only a few loyalists remained by his side. His reign, once marked by unity, was now characterized by paranoia and bloodshed. The court, which had once been a place of strategy and governance, had devolved into a place of fear and suspicion. Even Shaka's closest advisors began to see him not as the brilliant military leader he had once been, but as a man consumed by his own demons. It was in the midst of this unraveling that Shaka's downfall began. The internal dissatisfaction, combined with the growing disillusionment among his warriors, reached a boiling point. Shaka's own half-brother, Dingain, who had long been a loyal supporter, began to plot against him. Dingain, along with a group of conspirators within the royal family and the military, saw an opportunity to take the throne. They knew that Shaka's reign was crumbling and that the time had come to act. In early 1828, the conspiracy came to fruition. Dingain and his allies launched a coup, assassinating Shaka in a brutal and sudden attack. The king, once so powerful and feared, was slain in his own royal residence, brought down not by an enemy on the battlefield, but by the very people who had once stood beside him. Shaka's death marked the end of an era for the Zulu kingdom. The empire he had forged through bloodshed and vision was now at a crossroads, with no clear successor to fill the void left by his passing. The assassination of Shaka Zulu was a turning point not just for the Zulu kingdom, but for southern Africa as a whole. The kingdom, which had once been a dominant force in the region, began to fragment as rival factions vied for control. Shaka's death left the Zulu people without a strong central authority, and the empire he had built was no longer the cohesive power it had been. His once unified warriors, now leaderless and disillusioned, began to turn on each other, and the kingdom fell into a period of instability that would last for years. Shaka's legacy, while undeniable in its impact on African history, was a complicated one. He was a man who had risen from humble beginnings to create one of the most powerful military empires in history. His innovations in warfare, his military strategies, and his unyielding ambition had shaped the course of African history. Yet his tyrannical rule, his brutal purges, and his eventual downfall left behind a kingdom in ruins and a people divided. His death, though tragic, was the final chapter in a story of a king whose greatest strength, his unrelenting will, was ultimately the very thing that led to his downfall. In the wake of Shaka's death, the Zulu kingdom would never be the same. His successors would struggle to maintain the empire he had built, and the once great Zulu army, which had been the envy of Africa, would slowly lose its power. Shaka's vision, though monumental, was marred by his inability to adapt to the changing political landscape and the internal divisions that had taken root during his reign. In the end, Shaka Zulu's empire, like its creator, was a powerful force that could not withstand the weight of its own ambition. The death of Shaka Zulu in 1828 marked a dramatic turning point not only in the Zulu kingdom, but in the broader political landscape of southern Africa. Shaka, the king who had risen from an outcast to become one of the most formidable leaders the continent had ever seen, left behind a kingdom that, though powerful, was on the brink of collapse. His assassination, orchestrated by his half-brother Dingain, was a testament to the destructive forces that had been unleashed during Shaka's reign, forces that were now pulling the Zulu Empire apart from within. With the king's death, the empire he had built through bloodshed, innovation, and vision was left to unravel. Shaka's legacy, in the immediate aftermath of his death, was one of instability and fear. His once legendary military might, which had swept across southern Africa, was now in disarray. The Zulu kingdom, which had been a symbol of unity and strength, was fractured, with rival factions vying for control in the wake of the king's violent end. His half-brother Dingain, now the new king, took the throne with the blood of Shaka on his hands, and his rule was marked by uncertainty and conflict. Dingain's ascent to power, however, was far from assured. Though he was Shaka's closest living relative, Dingane was no natural leader. Unlike his brother, who had been a visionary and a master strategist, Dingane lacked the charisma and military prowess to command the loyalty of the Zulu warriors. Many within the kingdom, particularly the military elite, had grown weary of Shaka's increasingly erratic behavior, but they had also come to see him as a symbol of their unity and strength. Dingane, by contrast, was viewed by many as an opportunist, someone who had ascended to the throne through murder and manipulation rather than through any earned respect. The power vacuum left by Shaka's death sparked a period of chaos and violence. Factions within the Zulu kingdom began to fight for dominance, with different groups of warriors and chieftains attempting to assert their influence. The Zulu military, which had once been an unstoppable force, was now divided. Loyalty to the new king was not universal, and Dingane found himself struggling to maintain control over the vast empire his brother had forged. While some warriors pledged allegiance to Dingane, others, especially those who had once been loyal to Shaka, were less inclined to support him. They remembered the glory of Shaka's rule, and they were not ready to accept Dingane as their leader. The kingdom that Shaka had built with such determination and vision now seemed to be falling apart at the seams. At the same time, the external pressures on the Zulu kingdom were mounting. The arrival of European colonial powers, particularly the British and the Dutch, was beginning to reshape the dynamics of southern Africa. The British had already established a foothold in Cape Colony, and they were now looking to expand their influence across the region. The Zulu kingdom, once a formidable power, was now faced with the reality that it might soon be forced to contend with European imperialism in addition to internal dissent. While Shaka had been too preoccupied with internal affairs to engage with the Europeans, Dingane, despite his growing internal struggles, was faced with the undeniable fact that the colonial powers were beginning to encroach upon his kingdom. The British had long seen the Zulu kingdom as a significant threat to their ambitions in the region. Shaka's military prowess and the Zulus' dominance over neighboring tribes made them a formidable power, one that could potentially disrupt British plans to establish control over southern Africa. But by the time Dingane took the throne, the Zulu kingdom had already started to show signs of weakness. The internal strife, combined with Dingane's lack of military acumen, left the Zulus vulnerable to foreign intervention. In 1834, a group of British settlers known as the Voortrekkers, fleeing British rule in the Cape Colony, crossed into Zulu territory. Led by Piet Retief, they sought to establish a new settlement in what is now the interior of South Africa. While they initially sought a peaceful settlement with the Zulus, the relationship between the Voortrekkers and Dingane quickly soured. Retief, who had negotiated with Dingane for land in the region, was ambushed and killed along with his delegation. The slaughter of Retief and his men by Dingane's forces marked the beginning of a brutal conflict between the Zulu kingdom and the Voortrekkers. The killing of Retief and his men sparked outrage among the Voortrekkers, who sought revenge for the massacre. They soon mobilized a group of their own warriors and launched a series of raids against Zulu territory. While Dingane had inherited a kingdom in turmoil, his decision to murder the Voortrekker leader would prove to be a catastrophic misstep. The Voortrekkers, though fewer in number and less organized than the Zulu army, were determined and vengeful. They began to take the fight to the heart of the Zulu kingdom, and Dingane's forces found themselves ill-prepared for the onslaught. The conflict between the Zulu and the Voortrekkers culminated in the Battle of Blood River in 1838. The Voortrekkers, led by Andries Pretorius, managed to assemble a substantial force to confront the Zulus. Despite their smaller numbers, the Voortrekkers were equipped with modern firearms, which gave them a significant advantage over the Zulu warriors, who were still using traditional weapons. On the banks of the Nkum River, a bloody and decisive battle took place. The Voortrekkers, utilizing their firearms and defensive positions, inflicted a devastating defeat on the Zulu army. Thousands of Zulu warriors were killed, and Dingane's authority as king was further undermined by the crushing defeat. The loss at Blood River marked a turning point in the history of the Zulu kingdom. Dingane, unable to recover from the devastating defeat, fled from his capital at Umgungunlovu. His rule, which had been marked by instability, now came to an end. He was soon betrayed and killed by his own followers, and his death brought about the collapse of the short-lived reign that had followed Shaka's. Dingane's inability to maintain control of the Zulu kingdom and his failure to deal effectively with external threats sealed the fate of the empire that Shaka had built. Following Dingane's death, the Zulu kingdom would never be the same. The power of the Zulu kingship had been severely weakened, and the once mighty military force was no longer the dominant power it had been under Shaka. The internal fractures, combined with the loss of key battles to the Voortrekkers, had left the Zulu people in a state of disarray. The Zulu kingdom, though still a significant presence in southern Africa, would never regain the strength and unity it had under Shaka's leadership. The coming years would see the rise of new leaders within the Zulu ranks, but none would be able to match the military genius or the unyielding determination of Shaka himself. Dingane's reign and its disastrous end served as a stark reminder of the fragility of power. While Shaka had risen to greatness through sheer force of will and military prowess, his successors would find that maintaining an empire built on fear and violence was an inherently unstable endeavor. The Zulu kingdom's failure to adapt to changing circumstances, both internally and externally, ultimately led to its decline. Shaka's legacy, while monumental, was also a cautionary tale about the dangers of tyranny and the impermanence of power. The Zulu kingdom, like the man who had forged it, was a mighty force, but one that could not withstand internal divisions and external pressures that ultimately led to its downfall. After Dingane's death in 1840, the Zulu kingdom found itself once again in a state of chaos and uncertainty. The powerful and centralized empire that Shaka had created had fractured into competing factions, each vying for control. The once unified kingdom, built through conquest and sheer military might, was now a shadow of its former self. The collapse of Dingane's rule left a power vacuum, and with no clear successor, the Zulu kingdom was at a crossroads. Yet, even in the wake of such instability, the Zulu people remained proud, and a new figure would rise to take the reins of the fractured kingdom. The man who would step into this turbulent void was Mfecane, Shaka's half-brother. Unlike Dingane, who had been marked by instability and insecurity, Mfecane was a leader who sought to restore order and bring stability to a kingdom that had been torn apart by conflict. Mfecane, though not as militarily gifted as Shaka, was known for his diplomatic skills and ability to unite disparate groups. He had long been a figure in the background of Zulu politics, serving as a general under both Shaka and Dingane. While Shaka had dominated through force, Mfecane sought to lead through consensus and reconciliation. His rise to power was not a violent coup like Dingane's, but rather a slow, methodical process. By securing the loyalty of important military leaders and making alliances with rival factions, Mfecane was able to consolidate power and assume the kingship of the Zulu people. Upon taking power, Mfecane faced the immediate challenge of restoring the Zulu kingdom to its former strength. The kingdom was fractured, its military capabilities weakened, and the once feared Zulu warriors were now divided. The kingdom's territory had shrunk considerably, as neighboring tribes had seized the opportunity to challenge the Zulu in the wake of Dingane's weakness. Mfecane knew that his immediate task was to heal the divisions within the kingdom and secure the loyalty of his warriors. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the military and to reassert Zulu authority over the surrounding regions. Through a combination of diplomatic efforts and strategic alliances, Mfecane was able to reclaim some of the land lost during Dingane's reign and restore the Zulu kingdom's military prowess. However, Mfecane's rule was not without its challenges. The Zulu kingdom, while under his leadership, was still facing the external threat posed by European settlers and other African powers. The British had already established their presence along the coast, and their influence was spreading further inland. The Boers, having fled British-controlled areas, were now a force to be reckoned with in the interior of southern Africa. These European settlers were encroaching on land that the Zulus had long considered their own. Mfacane's kingdom, though recovering, was still not strong enough to confront these foreign powers directly. But Mfecane was a pragmatic leader, and he understood the need to tread carefully in dealing with the Europeans. He sought a delicate balance, maintaining the sovereignty of his people while also avoiding open confrontation with the increasingly powerful colonial forces. One of the most important moments in Mfacane's reign came in 1843, when he made a critical decision that would shape the future of the Zulu kingdom. The British, under the leadership of Sir Peregrine Maitland, had been pressing the Zulu for a treaty that would formalize their relationship with the kingdom. Mfecane, seeking to avoid the bloodshed that might come from a confrontation with the British, agreed to enter into negotiations. While many of his advisors pushed for a more aggressive stance against the British, Mfecane chose diplomacy over war. He signed the Treaty of Friendship with the British, which allowed the Zulu kingdom to maintain its autonomy while agreeing to a series of trade and diplomatic agreements with the British. The treaty, while seen as a diplomatic victory from Mfecane, was also a sign of the shifting balance of power in southern Africa. The Zulu kingdom, once a dominant force, was now forced to navigate a world in which European powers were asserting their influence over the region. The treaty, however, would not be the end of Mfacane's struggles. While it had allowed the Zulu to maintain their independence in the short term, the treaty also marked the beginning of a new chapter in which the Zulu kingdom would increasingly find itself caught between competing colonial powers. In the years that followed, Mfacane's kingdom faced new challenges. The Boer republics, which had been established in the interior, were growing in power and influence. The Boers had long been hostile to the British, and their expansion into Zulu territory presented a new threat to the Zulu kingdom. Mfecane, while seeking peace with the British, knew that the Boers would not be as conciliatory. The Boers, with their large farms and growing militias, were encroaching on Zulu land, and Mfecane could not afford to ignore them. In 1848, Mfacane's kingdom was forced to confront the growing Boer threat. The Boers, led by Andries Pretorius, launched a series of raids into Zulu territory, seeking to secure land for their growing settlements. Mfecane, unwilling to let the Boers take control of Zulu land, decided to take military action. The Zulu army, though not as strong as it had once been under Shaka, was still a formidable force, and Mfecane sought to defend his kingdom with a combination of military might and diplomatic maneuvering. The battle between the Zulus and the Boers was hard-fought, with both sides suffering casualties. The Boers, despite their superior weapons, were unable to decisively defeat the Zulu army, and Mfecane was able to retain control over his land. However, the conflict had exposed the vulnerability of the Zulu kingdom and the growing pressure from European settlers. As Mfacane's reign continued, the tension between the Zulu kingdom and European settlers intensified. The British, who had long seen the Zulu kingdom as a potential threat to their control over southern Africa, continued to exert pressure on Mfecane. The British wanted to expand their influence over the region, and they saw the Zulu kingdom as a major obstacle to their plans. Mfecane, while trying to maintain a delicate balance, could not ignore the growing threat posed by the British. In the early 1850s, the situation for the Zulu kingdom became even more precarious. The British, seeking to expand their territorial control, launched a series of military campaigns against neighboring African kingdoms. The Zulu kingdom, now weakened by years of internal strife and external conflict, was increasingly at risk. Mfacane's attempts to maintain neutrality and avoid war with the British were becoming more difficult. The British were now demanding more concessions from the Zulu kingdom, including land and resources, and Mfecane realized that the Zulu were not in a position to resist the growing power of the colonial forces. The internal divisions within the Zulu kingdom were also becoming more pronounced. Mfacane's sons, including the ambitious Cetshwayo, were beginning to challenge their father's authority. Cetshwayo, in particular, had grown disillusioned with Mfacane's approach to leadership. While Mfecane had sought to preserve peace with the European powers, Cetshwayo believed that the Zulu kingdom could only survive through military strength. The rivalry between father and son began to grow, and tensions between the factions within the royal family threatened to undermine Mfacane's authority. Despite these challenges, Mfacane's leadership remained crucial to the survival of the Zulu kingdom during this turbulent period. His diplomacy and cautious approach allowed the kingdom to maintain its autonomy for a time, but the forces of colonialism and internal strife were pushing the kingdom toward precipice. The decisions made during Mfacane's reign, particularly the treaty with the British, would have lasting consequences for the Zulu people. The kingdom that had once been a dominant force in southern Africa was now a kingdom struggling to maintain its independence in the face of growing colonial pressures and internal divisions. As Mfecane grew older, the question of succession and the future of the Zulu kingdom became more pressing. The stage was being set for the next phase of Zulu history, one that would see the rise of Cetshwayo and the eventual confrontation between the Zulu kingdom and the British Empire. As Mfacane's reign began to wane, the Zulu kingdom, though still formidable, found itself at a crossroads. The years of relative peace and diplomatic negotiations were beginning to come to an end, and a new, more tumultuous chapter in the history of the kingdom was unfolding. Mfacane's cautious approach to European colonial powers had allowed the Zulus to maintain their independence for several decades, but this was a fragile peace. His later years saw growing internal divisions, with the Zulu military and the royal family increasingly split over the kingdom's future direction. The power struggle within the royal family, especially between Mfacane's sons, signaled that a time of greater upheaval was on the horizon. At the heart of this growing unrest was Cetshwayo, Mfacane's eldest son and the heir apparent to the Zulu throne. While Mfecane had sought to preserve peace with the European powers, Cetshwayo, a man of decisive action and military prowess, believed that the future of the Zulu kingdom could only be assured through strength and resistance. Cetshwayo was a charismatic and capable leader, but he was also ambitious, and his views were diametrically opposed to his father's more diplomatic stance. Over time, Cetshwayo's growing frustration with Mfacane's cautious policies reached a boiling point. He felt that his father's inability to confront the external pressures of colonialism had weakened the Zulu kingdom. While Mfecane had made concessions to the British and the Boers in order to preserve peace, Cetshwayo believed that the only way for the Zulu kingdom to survive was through a return to the warrior ethos that had defined the empire under Shaka. By the mid-1850s, the tension between father and son had reached its peak. Mfecane, now an aging and increasingly frail ruler, found himself in the difficult position of trying to hold his kingdom together while managing the ambitions of his own family. Cetshwayo, growing in influence and popular support, began to assert himself more forcefully within the royal court. He sought to rally the Zulu military elite behind his vision of a more aggressive stance against the growing colonial threat, but his approach was not universally accepted. Many within the kingdom still revered Mfecane for his diplomatic efforts and the stability he had brought to the Zulu people after the tumultuous years of Shaka's rule. The court was deeply divided, and the conflict between the followers of Mfecane and those of Cetshwayo threatened to tear the kingdom apart. As Mfacane's health deteriorated in the early 1860s, the question of succession became more pressing. Mfacane's advisors, along with various factions within the royal family, saw the transition of power as a pivotal moment. Cetshwayo, however, was not content to simply wait for his father to pass peacefully. He was determined to seize power on his own terms, and in 1861, he launched a coup against his father, gaining control of the kingdom's army and military resources. The older king, now unable to hold onto the loyalty of his warriors, was forced to abdicate. With Mfacane's resignation, Cetshwayo ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of a new era for the Zulu kingdom. Cetshwayo's rise to power was not without challenges. The internal divisions within the kingdom had deepened, and the royal family was divided between those who supported Cetshwayo and those who remained loyal to the ideals and policies of Mfecane. The military was also divided, as many of the senior officers had sworn loyalty to Mfecane and were now forced to decide where their allegiances lay. Cetshwayo, who had long been viewed as a strong and capable leader, had the support of much of the Zulu military, but he still faced significant opposition from rival factions within his own court. The tension within the royal family created a volatile situation, one in which Cetewayo's leadership was constantly questioned by those who felt that he had come to power through force rather than legitimate succession. Despite these internal challenges, Cetewayo's reign marked a return to the military ethos that had defined the Zulu kingdom under Shaka. Cetewayo, with a strong sense of pride and ambition, sought to rebuild the Zulu army to its former glory. He reintroduced many of the military practices that had been associated with Shaka's reign, including the use of highly disciplined regiments known as impi. These units, made up of warriors from various clans, had been the cornerstone of the Zulu army under Shaka and were instrumental in the kingdom's rise to power. Under Cetewayo's leadership, the Zulu military regained its former discipline and unity, becoming once again a formidable force in southern Africa. Cetewayo's policies also had a strong focus on expanding the kingdom's territory. He was determined to restore Zulu dominance in the region, especially in areas that had been lost during the period of instability following Shaka's death. The neighboring British and Boer settlers, who had long encroached upon Zulu territory, were seen by Cetewayo as the primary external threat. The British, in particular, were becoming more assertive in their desire to expand their colonial holdings, and Cetewayo knew that the Zulu kingdom would soon have to face a confrontation with them. In 1870, the tension between the Zulus and the British reached a boiling point. The British, under the command of Sir Henry Bartle Frere, had been pursuing an aggressive policy of annexation and control in the region. Frere had been appointed as the British High Commissioner for Southern Africa, and he had been instructed to find a way to bring the Zulu kingdom into submission. His plan involved a series of demands placed upon Cetewayo, which included the disbandment of the Zulu army and the acceptance of British control over key areas of Zulu territory. Frere's actions, which included the issuing of an ultimatum to Cetewayo, were seen as a direct challenge to Zulu sovereignty. The British were determined to break the power of the Zulu kingdom once and for all, and they believed that Cetewayo's refusal to submit would lead to war. The ultimatum, which was issued in 1878, gave Cetewayo a limited time to comply with British demands. The Zulu king, however, refused to back down. He had spent years rebuilding the Zulu military and was not about to surrender his kingdom to the British. He knew that war was inevitable, and he began to prepare his forces for the confrontation that was soon to come. The British, for their part, were confident in their superiority. The British army, with its advanced weaponry, including rifles and artillery, was seen as virtually unstoppable by European observers. However, they underestimated the strength and resolve of the Zulu warriors, who were still a force to be reckoned with despite the years of colonial encroachment. In January 1879, the war that had been brewing for years erupted into full-scale conflict. The Zulu kingdom, under Cetewayo's leadership, faced off against the British Empire in what would become one of the most significant and dramatic military encounters of the colonial era. The first battle, at Isandlwana, would be a shocking and devastating defeat for the British. The Zulu army, using traditional weapons and tactics, inflicted a crushing blow on the British forces, killing over 1,000 British soldiers. The victory at Isandlwana, though short-lived, was a powerful statement that the Zulu kingdom was not easily subdued. It also served as a stark reminder of the resilience of the African kingdoms in the face of European imperialism. The Battle of Isandlwana, however, was only the beginning of a much larger and more drawn-out conflict. Despite the initial success, the British regrouped and mounted a more determined effort to bring the Zulu kingdom to its knees. The war would continue for several more months, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the end, Cetewayo's refusal to capitulate to British demands would lead to the destruction of the Zulu kingdom as an independent entity, but the initial resistance would go down in history as a testament to the strength and courage of the Zulu people. Cetewayo's reign, though short and marked by internal strife and external conflict, was a pivotal moment in the history of the Zulu kingdom. Under his leadership, the kingdom experienced a brief resurgence, but ultimately, The forces of European colonialism and the internal divisions within the Zulu royal family proved too much to overcome. Cetshwayo's legacy, like that of his father Shaka, would be one of both triumph and tragedy, as the Zulu kingdom's power faded in the face of an expanding British Empire. The Zulu people, though defeated, would never forget their struggle for sovereignty, and their story would live on as one of resistance against colonial domination. The final years of the Zulu kingdom, particularly during the reign of Cetshwayo, were marked by intense military conflict, dramatic shifts in political power, and the tragic decline of one of Southern Africa's most formidable empires. The Zulu kingdom, which had once dominated the region under Shaka Zulu, now found itself struggling to maintain its sovereignty in the face of ever-growing external pressures, most notably from the British Empire. As Cetshwayo's reign came to a dramatic and ultimately tragic end, it was clear that the Zulu kingdom, despite its remarkable resilience, was no longer the powerhouse it had once been. The conflict between the British and the Zulu reached its zenith in 1879 with the Anglo-Zulu War, a war that would ultimately result in the fall of the Zulu kingdom. However, it is important to understand that the war did not emerge from a single conflict, but from years of political and diplomatic tensions between the Zulu nation and the British Empire. By the time Cetshwayo took the throne, the Zulu kingdom had been pushed to the edge by growing British ambitions in southern Africa. Cetshwayo, a man known for his military acumen and his determination to defend the Zulu way of life, ascended to the throne in 1861 after a turbulent period of succession that had seen his father, Mfecane, step down. Having inherited a kingdom weakened by internal divisions, Cetshwayo immediately sought to consolidate power, rallying the Zulu military and reinforcing traditional military strategies that had been successful under Shaka. His primary concern, however, was the growing threat posed by the British. The British had already established their dominance in much of the southern part of Africa, and they had increasingly turned their eyes toward the Zulu kingdom, which stood as a powerful, independent entity in the region. The British, under the leadership of Sir Henry Bartle Frere, had a clear strategy to incorporate the Zulu kingdom into their colonial empire. In 1878, Frere issued an ultimatum to Cetshwayo, demanding that the Zulu king disband his military and accept British control over several areas of his kingdom. The British believed that by breaking the Zulu army, they could easily neutralize the most significant military threat to their expanding empire in southern Africa. The ultimatum, which was designed to provoke a response, included a series of harsh and unreasonable demands, and Cetshwayo's refusal to comply sealed the fate of the Zulu kingdom. Cetshwayo, despite recognizing the overwhelming power of the British military, was unwilling to surrender his kingdom without a fight. The Zulu king understood that his people's survival depended on their ability to defend themselves against the British, who were rapidly consolidating their hold over neighboring territories. Cetshwayo's decision to reject the ultimatum was rooted in a belief that resistance, even in the face of superior military power, was the only option for the Zulu people. He prepared his army for war, believing that he could rally his warriors and perhaps secure a decisive victory against the British. The conflict began with the Battle of Isandlwana, a battle that would go down in history as one of the greatest defeats ever suffered by the British Army. On January 22, 1879, the Zulu army, despite being outgunned and outnumbered, launched a fierce and coordinated attack on the British camp at Isandlwana. The British soldiers, who were accustomed to the superior firepower of their weapons, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and the tactical brilliance of the Zulu warriors. The battle was a stunning victory for the Zulu, with more than 1,300 British soldiers killed, and it sent shockwaves throughout the British Empire. The Zulu, who had once been seen as a primitive force, had just inflicted a humiliating defeat on the mightiest empire in the world. The victory at Isandlwana, however, was not without its costs. While it was a major blow to the British, it was also the beginning of the end for the Zulu kingdom. The British, humiliated but far from defeated, regrouped and began to bring in reinforcements. They realized that their initial underestimation of the Zulu forces had been a grave mistake, but they also recognized that the Zulu kingdom could not withstand the full might of the British Empire for long. The British were not content with merely defeating the Zulu army. They wanted to crush the very heart of the Zulu kingdom and bring Cetshwayo to heel. In the months following Isandlwana, the British launched a series of counteroffensives. The Zulu army, despite its initial triumph, was stretched thin and struggled to maintain control over their territory. The British, with their superior logistics and reinforcements, soon recovered from the initial shock of their defeat and pressed forward into the heart of Zululand. Cetshwayo, aware of the growing British presence, sought to hold his ground, but his forces were slowly being overwhelmed by the superior firepower and resources of the British. The next significant battle in the war occurred at Rorke's Drift, just a day after Isandlwana. The British, having suffered a devastating defeat at Isandlwana, regrouped at Rorke's Drift, where a small contingent of British soldiers defended their position against a much larger Zulu force. The battle at Rorke's Drift, though a British victory, was a costly one for the British, and it became a symbol of British determination and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The victory, however, did little to turn the tide of the war in favor of the British. The Zulu army, despite suffering setbacks, remained a formidable force. As the war dragged on, the Zulu kingdom, once unified and powerful under Shaka and Cetshwayo, began to crumble under the pressure of the British onslaught. Cetshwayo, despite his military brilliance, could not match the resources and advanced technology of the British military. The British, with their modern firearms, artillery, and well-supplied troops, eventually wore down the Zulu resistance. The kingdom was slowly but surely being consumed by the firepower of the British Empire. In July 1879, the British captured the Zulu capital of Ulundi, effectively signaling the end of the Anglo-Zulu War. Cetshwayo, despite his efforts to resist, was captured and exiled to Cape Town. His capture marked the end of the Zulu kingdom as an independent entity. The British disbanded the Zulu military, divided the kingdom into smaller factions, and placed it under British control. Cetshwayo, once the proud ruler of a mighty empire, was now a prisoner, and the Zulu people were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered kingdom. The fall of the Zulu kingdom was a tragic moment in African history, marking the end of one of the continent's most powerful empires. The Zulu had fought bravely and had achieved a remarkable victory at Isandlwana, but in the end, they were unable to withstand the might of the British military machine. The war left deep scars on the Zulu people, and the loss of their independence was a blow from which they would never fully recover. Cetshwayo, despite his exile, remained a symbol of resistance and defiance against British colonialism. Although he was not able to reclaim his throne, his courage and leadership during the Anglo-Zulu War earned him a lasting place in history as a hero of African resistance. For the Zulu people, the memory of Cetshwayo's fight against the British would endure for generations, and his story would serve as a reminder of the resilience and strength of their people in the face of colonial domination. The British, having defeated the Zulus, restructured the region, but they could never fully erase the legacy of the Zulu kingdom. While the Zulu people were subjugated, their culture, language, and traditions endured, serving as a source of pride and unity in the years to come. The Anglo-Zulu War was a decisive moment in the history of Southern Africa, one that marked the decline of the Zulu kingdom but also set the stage for the continued resistance against colonial rule.